You're sitting across the table, and they say a number first. Before you've even considered your own price, that number is already living in your head. Psychologists call this anchoring, and it's been studied for decades. The first figure spoken quietly becomes the reference point for everything that follows. In one classic study, people asked to guess a random number were then asked an unrelated question, and their estimates consistently drifted toward that first number, even when it had nothing to do with the answer. A car dealer who opens high gets a higher final price. A student who hears a harsh grading curve first accepts a lower score as fair. A partner who says, "I deserve at least this much," shapes what feels reasonable before you've said a word. It works because the brain doesn't judge numbers on their own. It measures distance from whatever it heard first. This sounds backwards, but the anchor doesn't need to be reasonable to work. Even an absurd opening number still drags your final answer toward it. So the next time someone throws out a number before you're ready, pause before you respond. Because in negotiation, the first number spoken is rarely the real number. It's the leash. You're mid-conversation when someone says, "I hate to even ask, but," and something in you softens before you even hear the request. Psychologists studying persuasion have found that certain phrases work as pressure valves. They lower your guard the second before the real ask lands. Researchers tracking manipulative language notice the same shortlist appearing again and again, right before a demand. "I hate to ask. You're the only one who can. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Just this once." A coworker who softens a request with guilt gets more unpaid overtime. A friend who frames a loan as an emergency gets repaid faster and asked fewer questions. A partner who says, "If you really loved me," gets compliance without ever making an argument. It works because these phrases disarm scrutiny before your brain has time to evaluate the actual request. This feels like kindness, but the softness is the mechanism, not the message. The gentler the setup, the harder the request usually is to refuse. So the next time a sentence starts with an apology you didn't ask for, listen for what comes after it. Because the softest opening often carries the heaviest ask. You hear the words, "I'm sorry," and for a second it feels like relief. Then something shifts, and somehow you're the one explaining yourself. Psychologists studying manipulation call this pattern DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender, and it hides inside apologies more often than people realize. Research on abusive communication patterns shows the sequence is nearly identical every time. A quick apology, followed by a justification, followed by a complaint about how the apology was received. A partner who says sorry, then adds, "But you always overreact," shifts the weight back onto you. A boss who apologizes for yelling, then mentions how stressful you've made their week, collects sympathy instead of giving accountability. A friend who says sorry, then goes quiet and waits for you to comfort them, turns your hurt into their burden. It works because a real apology and a tactical one sound almost the same in the first 4 words. The difference only shows up in what follows. This sounds like empathy, but if an apology needs your reassurance to complete itself, it was never really an apology. Watch what comes after the sorry, not the sorry itself. Because the real apology ends with your feelings. The tactical one ends with theirs. Messages every morning, compliments flooding every conversation. It feels like finally being seen, and you can't remember the last time someone made you feel this wanted. Psychologists studying attachment call this love bombing, and decades of research on manipulative relationships show it follows a near-identical script. The affection arrives too fast, too intense, too early, often before the person actually knows you. Someone who calls you their soulmate in the first week is describing a fantasy, not a person. Someone who wants constant contact within days isn't building closeness, they're building dependency. Someone who showers you with gifts before earning basic trust is buying access, not offering generosity. It works because intensity feels like proof, when really it's just volume. This sounds like romance, but real connection is built slowly. And anything built this fast is built to collapse just as fast. The flood always precedes a drought, and the drought is the part they never warn you about. So the next time affection arrives faster than trust has had time to grow, notice the pace before you notice the feeling. Because what floods in overnight usually drains out just as fast. Do you want to talk about this now or later? It sounds like freedom, two open doors, but look closer, both lead to the same room. Psychologists call this the illusion of choice, and it's one of the oldest tricks in persuasion because it removes the one option that was never offered. No. A parent who asks, before dinner or after, never asked if the chore gets done at all. A salesperson who asks, the blue one or the black one, skipped the question of whether you're buying anything. A partner who asks, should we talk now or after the party, never left room for, we don't need to talk about this. It works because once you're choosing between two paths, your mind stops questioning whether a third path, refusal, exists. This sounds like respect, but real respect includes the option to say no, and this trick is built specifically to remove it. Notice when a question only offers you the how and never the whether, because being handed two doors doesn't mean you agreed to enter the room. You hang up the phone, and even though nothing happened, you feel like you did something wrong. Psychologists describe this as guilt tripping, a manipulation pattern that attaches moral debt to ordinary choices. Research on coercive communications shows the phrasing barely changes across relationships. After everything I've done for you, turns a request into a debt you supposedly owe. A parent who says, I guess I'll just sit here alone, turns your evening plans into abandonment. A partner who says, if you loved me, you'd do this, turns a preference into a test of loyalty. A coworker who mentions staying late last night turns your normal workday into a comparison you're losing. It works because humans are wired for fairness, and the accusation of selfishness makes most people overcorrect just to prove it isn't true. This sounds like conscience, but conscience responds to something you actually did, not to someone else's disappointment. Guilt that appears without a real reason usually isn't yours to hold. Notice when the discomfort shows up right after a conversation instead of after an action. Because real guilt follows your choices. Manufactured guilt follows their moods. Someone tells you you're the smartest person in the room, and it feels good for exactly as long as it takes them to ask you for something. Psychologists studying influence tactics call this strategic flattery, and studies on persuasion consistently find that praise delivered right before a request is remembered less as a compliment and more as a setup. A compliment that arrives out of nowhere, with no context, is the first sign. A compliment that's oddly specific to something you're insecure about is the second. A compliment followed almost immediately by a request is the third. A compliment that only ever comes from this one person, never from anyone else who knows you, is the fourth. And a compliment that makes you feel obligated rather than simply appreciated is the fifth. It works because praise lowers your guard exactly when scrutiny matters most. This sounds like admiration, but real admiration doesn't come with a timer attached to it. Notice what follows the kind words, not just the words themselves. Because sincere praise asks for nothing in return. Strategic praise is already asking before you've said yes. You make an offer, and instead of a response, you get nothing. The silence stretches, and before you know it, you're the one talking again, sweetening the deal you never needed to sweeten. Psychologists call this the uncomfortable pause, and negotiation research shows most people can only tolerate a few seconds of true silence before they rush to fill it. A buyer who names a price, then goes quiet, often watches the seller lower it without being asked. An interviewer who lets an answer sit in silence often gets a candidate revealing more than they meant to. A partner who goes quiet mid-argument often gets you apologizing first, just to end the discomfort. It works because silence feels like pressure, and most people would rather give something away than sit inside that pressure. This sounds like patience, but patience used as a weapon isn't patience. It's a weight designed to make you blink first. Notice when a silence appears immediately after you've said something important. Because the quiet that follows your offer isn't empty, it's calculated. They hurt you again, and somehow, within minutes, you're the one explaining why it wasn't really that bad. Psychologists call this trauma bonding, an attachment formed through repeating cycles of harm followed by relief. Research on abusive relationship patterns shows the bond isn't built by the good moments alone, it's built by the contrast between the bad ones and the relief that follows them. A partner who explodes, then apologizes with unusual tenderness, becomes both the wound and the medicine. A friend who criticizes you, then offers rare warmth right after, keeps you chasing that warmth more than you notice the criticism. A parent who withdraws love, then returns it just as suddenly, teaches a child to crave the return more than they question the absence. It works because the brain latches harder onto relief that comes after pain than onto comfort that was never threatened. This sounds like loyalty, but loyalty isn't supposed to require recovery time. Notice if you're defending someone more often than you're enjoying them, because the tighter you hold on after they hurt you, the less it's love keeping you there, and the more it's the pattern. Someone says, "I could be wrong, but..." and instantly you trust them more, even before they've said anything else. Psychologists studying persuasion have found that a touch of uncertainty often reads as more credible than total confidence, because certainty can feel rehearsed while doubt feels honest. But the same phrase can be used two different ways. A genuine expert says, "I could be wrong," and then gives you a real, checkable reason. A manipulator says the same words, then gives you nothing but the appearance of humility, using it as armor against being challenged. A mentor who admits uncertainty invites your questions. A manipulator who admits uncertainty discourages them, because the softness was never really an opening, it was a shield. It works because both versions sound identical in the first 4 words, and most people never listen past them. This sounds like the same trait, but real humility can survive being questioned further. Manipulative uncertainty can't. Notice what happens when you push past the doubt and ask for more. Because honest uncertainty invites more conversation. Manufactured uncertainty ends it. It starts small, a forgotten word, a detail twisted, and you're told you remembered it wrong. Psychologists call this gaslighting, a slow distortion of reality that has been studied in abusive relationships for decades. The term comes from a classic film where a husband dims the lights in his home, then insists nothing has changed until his wife stops trusting her own senses. A partner who insists that never happened after you clearly remember it happening makes you question your memory instead of their honesty. A boss who denies a conversation you know took place makes you doubt your own notes. A parent who rewrites family history makes you doubt your own childhood. It works because most people trust someone they depend on more than they trust their own recall, especially when the doubt arrives calmly and repeatedly. This sounds like confusion, but real confusion doesn't follow a pattern. Gaslighting does. The same denial, the same calm certainty every time. Notice if your memory only feels unreliable around one specific person. Because your mind isn't broken, it's being told it is. You bring up a problem, and suddenly a third person's name enters the conversation, and now you're not solving anything, you're competing. Psychologists call this triangulation, a manipulation tactic that keeps control at the center by turning a two-person conflict into a contest. A parent who compares one child to another keeps both children chasing approval instead of questioning the comparison. A friend who says, "Well, Sarah agrees with me," turns a disagreement into a vote you didn't know was happening. A partner who brings up an ex mid-argument shifts the fight from the issue to your own insecurity. It works because being compared to someone else triggers a need to prove yourself, and that need is louder than the original question of what's actually fair. This sounds like someone gathering opinions, but real opinions get gathered openly, not deployed as leverage mid-conflict. Notice when a third name enters a conversation that was only ever between the two of you, because the moment a triangle forms, the real issue disappears, and all that's left is you fighting for a position you never agreed to compete for. You send a message, nothing comes back. Hours pass, then days, and the silence starts to feel heavier than any argument could. Psychologists studying emotional manipulation describe this as the silent treatment, a form of control that works precisely because it looks like nothing at all. Unlike an argument, it leaves no words to examine, only an absence that grows the longer it lasts. A partner who goes quiet until you apologize first isn't processing, they're negotiating through silence. A parent who withdraws affection until a child complies isn't hurt, they're conditioning. A manager who freezes out an employee until they fall in line isn't distracted, they're disciplining. It works because rejection activates the same distress in the brain as physical pain, and most people will do almost anything to make that distress stop. This sounds like someone needing space, but real space doesn't come with an unspoken price attached to ending it. Notice if the silence only lifts once you've changed your behavior, Because real distance doesn't demand a ransom. Strategic silence always does. One day there's warmth, affection, attention so intense it feels like proof. Then it vanishes, and you spend the next few days trying to earn it back. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement, and decades of research on reward and behavior show that unpredictable rewards create stronger attachment than consistent ones ever could. It's the same mechanism behind gambling. Steady losses don't hook you, but the unpredictable win does. A partner who is warm one day and cold the next keeps you chasing the warm days far more than you notice the cold ones. A friend whose approval comes and goes without pattern keeps you working harder for it than a friend whose approval is stable. A boss who praises rarely but unpredictably gets more effort from a team than one who praises consistently. It works because your brain treats uncertainty as a reason to try harder, not a reason to walk away. This sounds like passion, but real connection doesn't require you to guess whether it's still there. Notice if you feel more anxious than comforted around this person. Because consistency builds trust. Uncertainty builds obsession. If you really cared about me, you'd do this. The words don't sound like a threat, but the meaning underneath is unmistakable. Psychologist Susan Forward described this pattern as emotional blackmail, built on 4 repeating steps: a demand, your hesitation, pressure through guilt, and finally, submission out of exhaustion rather than agreement. A partner who ties your love to your compliance turns every request into a loyalty test. A parent who frames disappointment as a moral failure turns ordinary boundaries into betrayal. A friend who reminds you what they've sacrificed turns a simple no into an act of cruelty. It works because it attacks the exact things people are least willing to risk: being loved, being seen as good, keeping the relationship intact. This sounds like closeness, but real closeness never requires proof through obedience. Notice if saying no to this person feels like a moral crime instead of a normal boundary. Because love doesn't come with conditions attached to your compliance. Blackmail always does. They hurt you, and somehow, within minutes, you're the one apologizing. Psychologists call this pattern DARVO: deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. And research on abusive dynamics shows it follows an almost identical script every time. The aggressor denies what happened, attacks your credibility for bringing it up, then reframes themselves as the one who's actually suffering. A partner who raises their voice then says, "Look what you made me do," turns their own behavior into your fault. A boss who bullies then claims they're the one being disrespected, flips accountability before you can even name what happened. A friend who breaks a promise then acts wounded that you noticed, makes their failure your problem to manage. It works because most people don't want to see themselves as cruel, and that hesitation is exactly the gap the aggressor slips through. This sounds like sensitivity, but real sensitivity doesn't appear only after being caught. Notice who ends up comforting whom after the harm was done. Because the real victim rarely has to perform the role. The aggressor always does. They mention someone else a little too often, or praise a stranger just enough to sting, and suddenly you're working harder for attention you already had. Psychologists call this provoked jealousy, and research on relationship control shows it's rarely accidental. It's a deliberate way to shift your focus from their behavior to your own insecurity. A partner who brings up an ex in casual conversation isn't reminiscing, they're testing your reaction. A friend who praises someone else's success in front of you isn't being generous, they're creating comparison. A coworker who compliments a rival just within earshot isn't being kind, they're recalibrating your competitiveness. It works because jealousy hijacks attention faster than almost any other emotion, pulling focus away from the manipulator and onto your own fear of losing ground. This sounds like admiration for someone else, but real admiration doesn't need an audience of one insecure person watching. Notice if the timing of the praise always lines up with moments they want something from you. Because jealousy planted on purpose isn't a feeling, it's a leash. Someone describes you so precisely it feels like they've read your mind, and you lean in before realizing the description would fit almost anyone. Psychologists call this the Barnum effect, named after the showman who understood that vague statements feel deeply personal when phrased with enough confidence. In a well-known study, people were given identical personality descriptions and nearly all rated them as remarkably accurate, convinced the words were written specifically for them. A stranger who says, "You're often misunderstood," sounds insightful to almost anyone who's ever felt unseen. A coworker who says, "You care more than people realize," lands the same way regardless of who's listening. A new acquaintance who says, "You don't let just anyone get close," feels intimate, though it applies to nearly everyone. It works because the brain searches for itself in vague language and fills in the blanks that make it feel true. This sounds like being understood, but understanding requires specifics, not flattering generalities. Notice if the insight would apply just as easily to a stranger standing beside you. Because feeling seen isn't the same as actually being known. They tell you something oddly specific, a name, a detail from your past, and it feels impossible that they could know it. Psychologists studying cold and hot reading make a clear distinction. Cold reading guesses, but hot reading uses information quietly gathered beforehand and presents it as intuition. Someone who mentions a detail they overheard earlier isn't psychic, they were listening. Someone who references something from your social media isn't reading your energy, they scrolled your profile. Someone who repeats a story your friend told them isn't uncovering a secret, they're recycling gossip and calling it insight. It works because surprise short-circuits skepticism. When someone knows something they shouldn't, your brain assumes deep understanding instead of quiet research. This sounds like connection, but real connection is built through conversation, not through information gathered in advance and revealed for effect. Notice if the impossible knowledge always traces back to something you or someone near you said recently. Because it isn't magic when someone already did their homework. Someone tosses out a vague guess about you, and your face does the rest of the talking before you say a word. Psychologists studying nonverbal communication call this body language fishing, a technique where a guesser reads micro-reactions rather than actually knowing anything. A vague statement like, "You're thinking about someone important," isn't insight. It's a hook waiting for your face to confirm or deny it. A slight pause after a guess isn't coincidence. It's the fisher recalibrating based on your hesitation. A confident follow-up after your smallest reaction isn't intuition. It's someone adjusting their aim using the clue you just handed them. It works because your body leaks information faster than your mind can filter it, and a skilled observer only needs a flicker to correct course. This sounds like insight, but real insight doesn't require watching your face for permission to continue guessing. Notice if the accuracy only ever follows your own reaction, never comes before it. Because they're not reading your mind, they're reading your face and calling it your mind. Someone plants one small suspicion, and suddenly you start noticing evidence everywhere that fits it. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, the tendency to search for and remember information that confirms what we already believe, while quietly ignoring what contradicts it. In classic experiments, people told to look for a trait in someone found it everywhere, even when shown identical behavior to people told to look for the opposite trait. A partner who says, "I think they don't actually like you," plants a seed that reshapes how you read every future interaction. A friend who hints at betrayal before you've seen any makes you interpret silence as guilt. A manipulator who feeds you one suspicion doesn't need to convince you of anything else, because your own mind builds the rest of the case. This sounds like intuition, but real intuition doesn't need to be planted by someone else first. Notice where the original suspicion actually came from before you trust the pattern you're now seeing everywhere. Because once a seed is planted, your mind stops looking for truth and starts looking for proof. If you don't decide right now, the offer disappears. The pressure builds, and suddenly you're agreeing to something you hadn't even finished thinking about. Psychologists studying decision-making have found that time pressure pushes people away from analysis and toward instinct, which is exactly why manufactured urgency works so reliably. A salesperson who insists the deal ends tonight isn't giving you information, they're removing your ability to think it through. A friend who says, "Decide now or I'll ask someone else," isn't respecting your time, they're weaponizing it. A partner who demands an answer immediately during a difficult conversation isn't seeking clarity, they're preventing you from getting any. It works because urgency shuts down reflection, and a rushed brain reaches for the fastest exit instead of the right one. This sounds like decisiveness being required of you, but real decisions rarely need to happen in the next 60 seconds. Notice if the deadline conveniently appears right when doubt does, because real opportunities can survive a pause, Manufactured ones can't. Someone shrugs and says, "Maybe this isn't right for you." And suddenly, you want it more than you did a minute ago. Psychologists explain this through reactance theory. When a choice feels like it's being taken away, people fight harder to reclaim it, even if they were indifferent moments before. A salesperson who pulls back interest right as you hesitate isn't losing interest in the sale, they're engineering your urgency. A friend who says, "Maybe I'm asking too much," isn't backing down, they're prompting you to prove otherwise. A partner who says, "Forget it, it doesn't matter," mid-conversation isn't letting it go, they're baiting you to chase the resolution. It works because losing access to a choice feels worse than never having the choice at all, and that discomfort pushes people to act before they've actually decided anything. This sounds like someone respecting your hesitation, but real respect doesn't come wrapped in a strategic retreat. Notice if the pullback arrives exactly when your interest was still uncertain, because wanting something more the moment it's taken away isn't desire. It's a reflex being pulled on purpose. Without this, you could lose everything. The message doesn't offer you anything, it just makes the alternative feel unbearable. Psychologists studying decision-making have found that loss feels far heavier than gain, which is why fear-based persuasion so often skips the benefits entirely and goes straight for the threat. An ad that focuses on what happens if you don't act isn't selling protection, it's selling dread. A partner who says, "I don't know if we'll last if you don't do this," isn't expressing concern, they're issuing an ultimatum disguised as vulnerability. A boss who implies your job is at risk without saying it directly isn't managing performance, they're managing your fear. It works because fear narrows thinking down to the fastest escape route, and the person creating the fear is usually the one standing right beside the exit sign. This sounds like a warning, but real warnings come with facts attached, not just a feeling of dread. Notice if the message tells you what to fear more than it tells you what's actually true. Because persuasion built on dread isn't information, it's a push toward panic. You've already given so much, time, effort, years, and that's exactly why you can't seem to leave. Psychologists call this the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to keep investing in something simply because of what's already been invested, even when walking away would clearly be wiser. Research on decision-making shows people double down on failing choices specifically to avoid feeling like the earlier investment was wasted. A partner who reminds you how long you've been together isn't offering reassurance. They're using history as leverage to keep you from leaving. A job that keeps you through guilt about the years you've already given isn't loyalty. It's a trap dressed as commitment. A friend group that keeps you around through shared history alone, without shared respect, isn't friendship. It's inertia. It works because the mind hates admitting waste, and staying feels like avoiding that admission, even when staying creates more of it. This sounds like commitment, but real commitment is chosen fresh each day, not defended because of what's already been spent. Notice if "we've already come this far" is the only reason left to stay. By the end of a long, draining conversation, you agree to something you would have refused an hour earlier. Psychologists call this decision fatigue. The idea that every choice drains mental energy, and by the end of a long stretch of decisions, the mind reaches for whatever requires the least effort. Research on judicial decisions even found that outcomes shifted measurably based on how tired the decision-maker was, not on the facts of the case. A salesperson who keeps you in the store for hours before presenting the real decision isn't being thorough, they're exhausting your resistance. A partner who argues the same point repeatedly until you finally agree isn't debating, they're waiting you out. A negotiator who drags a conversation late into the night isn't being inefficient, they're counting on your exhaustion to do what their argument couldn't. It works because a tired brain chooses relief over accuracy every time. This sounds like persistence winning you over, but real persuasion doesn't need to outlast your energy to succeed. Notice if you agreed because you were convinced or because you were simply too tired to keep saying no. You're faced with too many options, and somehow you walk away having chosen nothing at all, more than happy to let someone else decide instead. Psychologists call this choice overload. A well-known study on shoppers found that when faced with dozens of options, far fewer people actually made a purchase than when the options were narrowed down. A contract stuffed with endless clauses isn't thorough. It's designed to exhaust your attention before you reach the important line. A sales pitch loaded with add-ons and upgrades isn't generous. It's built to overwhelm your ability to compare. A difficult decision presented with too many emotional variables at once isn't complexity. It's a fog someone else is counting on you to get lost in. It works because too many options don't feel like freedom. They feel like paralysis. And paralysis makes people gladly hand the decision to whoever offers a simple way out. This sounds like abundance, but real abundance doesn't need to exhaust you to be valuable. Notice if the sheer number of options appeared right before someone offered to simplify things for you. Because confusion is rarely an accident when someone benefits from your surrender. They tell you you're perfect for them within days, and the words feel enormous, even though nothing has actually been tested yet. Psychologists studying attachment patterns note that early, intense declarations often say more about the speaker's strategy than the relationship's depth. Real closeness is demonstrated over time, not announced ahead of it. Someone who calls you their soulmate before truly knowing your habits is describing a feeling, not a fact. Someone who promises a future in the first few conversations is selling a vision, not building a foundation. Someone whose words never quite match consistent, reliable action is offering performance instead of presence. It works because words are fast and free, while trust is slow and earned, and a manipulator would always rather give you the fast version. This sounds like passion, but real passion eventually shows up as consistency, not just as declarations. Notice if the words keep escalating while the actions stay exactly the same. Because anyone can tell you you're everything, fewer people actually show up like it. Something goes wrong, and right on cue, the same person who could have caused it shows up as the one who fixes it. Psychologists studying persuasion note how powerful this reversal is. When you believe you sought out the help yourself, your guard drops completely, because the request feels like your idea, not theirs. A coworker who quietly causes a problem, then swoops in to solve it, isn't helpful. They're engineering your gratitude. A friend who spreads a rumor, then comforts you when it reaches you, isn't supportive. They're managing both ends of your trust. A partner who creates a small crisis, then calms it perfectly, isn't stabilizing the relationship. They're proving their own necessity. It works because gratitude for being rescued blinds you to the possibility that the rescue was staged. This sounds like coincidence, but real coincidences don't repeat themselves around the same convenient hero. Notice who tends to be nearby right before the problem starts. Because the person who keeps saving you might also be the one setting the trap. Someone makes you feel wanted faster than seems reasonable, and before you notice, you're sharing things you never planned to share. Psychologists describe this as a honey trap, a manipulation built not on threats, but on attraction, where compliance feels like desire instead of pressure. A coworker who flirts just enough to get favors isn't being warm. They're using charm as currency. A stranger online who builds intimacy at lightning speed isn't falling for you, they're building leverage. A friend who uses affection selectively to control access to themselves isn't close to you, they're managing you with warmth. It works because attraction floods the brain with the same chemicals tied to trust, and in that state, skepticism simply doesn't get invited to the conversation. This sounds like chemistry, but real chemistry doesn't need to extract something from you to feel real. Notice if the closeness only ever escalates right before a favor, secret, or concession is needed. Because charm used as a tool isn't affection. It's bait with better lighting. Before the real conversation even starts, a few casual words have already decided how you're going to feel about it. Psychologists call this priming, subtle exposure to words or ideas that quietly steer behavior and emotion without your awareness. Classic studies found that people exposed to words associated with rudeness became more likely to interrupt, while those exposed to words about patience waited far longer before speaking. A partner who mentions how tired and dramatic you've seemed lately isn't observing, they're preloading how you'll be perceived in the argument that follows. A manager who casually references team players right before a hard ask is priming you to feel disloyal if you refuse. A friend who brings up how sensitive you've been before delivering criticism is preparing your reaction before you've even heard the criticism itself. It works because the brain processes primed language before it processes the actual content that follows. This sounds like small talk, But real small talk doesn't conveniently set the emotional stage right before a difficult ask. Notice the words spoken just before the real conversation begins. You're told a decision has a small chance of failure, and suddenly it feels terrifying, even though the odds never actually changed. Psychologists call this the framing effect. Identical information can trigger completely different reactions depending on how it's phrased. Studies on decision-making found that describing a treatment as 90% survival reassures people, while describing the same treatment as 10% death alarms them, despite meaning exactly the same thing. A salesperson who highlights the cost of missing out instead of the cost of buying is shaping your fear, not your logic. A partner who says, "You're never around," instead of, "I miss you," turns a feeling into an accusation. A boss who frames a request as letting the team down, instead of simply asking for help, adds guilt to a neutral situation. It works because emotion responds to the wording long before logic gets a chance to catch up. This sounds like information, but real information doesn't need a frightening frame to be understood. Notice if the same fact would feel completely different phrased another way. Because the frame isn't the truth. It's the lens someone chose for you. Someone insists you said something you're almost certain you never said, and slowly, you start to wonder if maybe they're right. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus proved in famous experiments that confidently suggested details can become vivid false memories, even for events that never happened at all. A partner who insists, "That's not what happened, this is," repeatedly isn't correcting you. They're rewriting the record while you're too unsettled to resist. A friend who adds details to a shared memory that you don't quite recognize isn't remembering more clearly, they're filling gaps with fiction. A family member who repeats a version of your childhood you don't recall isn't preserving history, they're constructing one. It works because memory rebuilds itself every time you recall it, and a confident suggestion can slip into that rebuilding without you noticing the seam. This sounds like a disagreement about facts, but real disagreements don't require you to abandon your own memory to resolve them. Notice if certainty about your own past only wavers around one specific person. Because a memory shouldn't need someone else's permission to feel real. Someone slips a small false detail into a story you both witnessed, and weeks later, you're certain that detail was always there. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated this with a famous study on eyewitnesses. A single altered word in a question was enough to make people recall details, like broken glass, that never existed in the original footage. A partner who describes an argument slightly differently every time you revisit it slowly reshapes what you remember about who said what. A coworker who repeats an inaccurate version of a meeting until it becomes the office's accepted story isn't clarifying, they're overwriting it. A friend who insists a moment went differently than you recall, it makes you doubt details you were originally certain about. It works because memory doesn't play back like a recording, it rebuilds each time, and stray details slip into the gaps unnoticed. This sounds like a difference of perspective, but real differences don't usually change which concrete facts you remember happening. Notice if your memory of an event keeps shifting toward whatever version this one person keeps repeating. Because repetition isn't proof, it's just repetition. You're certain something is true, but you can't quite remember where you first heard it. And that gap is exactly where manipulation slips in. Psychologists call this source confusion, the tendency to remember information long after forgetting where it actually came from. Studies on memory show that people often recall a statement as established fact, even when it originally came from a casual, unverified remark. A rumor repeated by one unreliable person can end up sounding like something you always knew, once its origin fades from memory. A political claim heard once in passing can resurface months later feeling like common knowledge. A story planted deliberately by someone with an agenda can outlive their credibility completely once you've forgotten who told it to you. It works because untethered facts feel just as convincing as verified ones, and the brain rarely double-checks its own sources once time has passed. This sounds like knowledge, but real knowledge can usually be traced back to something solid. Notice if you can't actually remember where a strong belief first came from. Because a fact with no traceable source might not be a fact at all. You see the flaw in the plan clearly, but everyone around the table is nodding, so you stay quiet too. Psychologist Irving Janis first documented this pattern after studying major group decisions that went catastrophically wrong despite being made by capable, intelligent people. Groupthink thrives on the fear of being the one dissenting voice, and that fear alone is often enough to silence real concerns before they're ever spoken. A team that watches a bad project continue because no one wants to be the first to object isn't being supportive, it's being paralyzed. A family that keeps a harmful tradition alive because questioning it feels disloyal isn't preserving values, it's avoiding conflict. A friend group that lets a bad decision move forward unchallenged isn't being agreeable, it's protecting harmony over honesty. It works because breaking consensus feels riskier than staying wrong together, even when staying wrong has real consequences. This sounds like unity, but real unity can survive disagreement. Groupthink can't. Notice if your silence in a group comes from agreement or simply from not wanting to be the only one who speaks. Something is clearly wrong, but you look around, see everyone else standing still, and somehow that stillness convinces you to do nothing too. Psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley proved this decades ago. When people believe they're the only witness, they act quickly. But in a crowd, responsibility quietly diffuses until almost no one moves. A group chat that watches someone get mistreated without anyone stepping in isn't being neutral, it's diffusing responsibility across everyone until it belongs to no one. A meeting room full of people who notice a problem but assume someone else will raise it isn't being cautious, it's collectively freezing. A crowd that watches a situation unfold, waiting for someone else to react first, isn't indifferent, it's caught in the same silent calculation everyone else is making. It works because inaction feels safer when it's shared, even when sharing it changes nothing about the outcome. This sounds like restraint, but real restraint is a choice, not a freeze caused by counting on someone else. Notice if you're waiting for permission that a crowd will never actually give. Surrounded by enough people acting the same way, you find yourself doing things you'd never consider doing alone. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo and others studied this effect called de-individuation, showing how anonymity inside a group quietly dissolves personal accountability. A crowd that turns aggressive convinces individuals inside it that responsibility now belongs to everyone, which functionally means it belongs to no one. An online space full of anonymous voices convinces people to say things they'd never say attached to their name. A group chant or shared symbol convinces individuals to act as we instead of I, loosening the grip of their usual restraint. It works because identity feels protective, and once anonymity or group immersion strips that identity away, the usual moral breaks stop engaging the way they normally would. This sounds like belonging, but real belonging doesn't require abandoning your own judgment to stay inside it. Notice if you'd still make the same choice with your name clearly attached to it. Because the version of you that only exists inside a crowd isn't a truer version, it's just an unaccountable one. They do something generous for you, and somehow, from that moment forward, you owe them something that was never actually discussed. Psychologists describe this as transactional manipulation, where a gift or favor is quietly designed to create leverage rather than goodwill. A boss who offers special treatment, then expects unquestioned loyalty in return, isn't being generous. They're planting a debt. A partner who reminds you, after everything I've done for you, is converting an old kindness into present-day control. A friend who does favor after favor, each one slightly obligating you further, isn't building friendship, they're building a ledger. It works because reciprocity is one of the strongest human instincts. We hate feeling indebted, so we comply just to restore balance, even when the balance was rigged from the start. This sounds like generosity, but real generosity doesn't keep score. Notice if kindness from this person always seems to come with an invisible invoice attached. Because a gift that expects repayment was never really a gift. 3 options sit in front of you, priced strangely, and by the time you've tried to compare them, you've stopped thinking clearly and just picked the middle one. Psychologists studying consumer behavior call this confusion pricing, a deliberate strategy that overwhelms comparison so people default to whatever feels safest rather than what's actually the best value. A subscription stacked with add-ons, discounts, and hidden fees isn't complicated by accident. It's complicated so you'll stop trying to calculate the real cost. A negotiation buried in shifting terms and conditions isn't thorough. It's designed to tire your attention before the important clause. A decision presented with too many overlapping variables at once isn't complexity. It's a fog someone benefits from you getting lost inside. It works because a tired mind stops asking what's the best choice and starts asking what's the easiest one to make. This sounds like abundance of options, but real value doesn't usually need confusion to look appealing. Notice if the offer only makes sense once you've stopped trying to fully understand it. Because clarity rarely needs to hide behind noise, confusion almost always does.